This week on Gaming the Podcast, we're focusing our attentions on a single individual, Hideo Kojima, the man behind the Metal Gear Solid franchise, the more recent Death Stranding, as well as the likes of PT, Snatcher and Policenauts. He's been called a legend, an icon, a visionary, and also, in some quarters, he's been called overrated and self-indulgent. Is he any of these things? Is he all of these things? As ever, I'm John Robertson and I'll be joined by Stace Harmon. If you enjoy the episodes, then please do share it with your friends, and we'll be very grateful if you could leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, as it does help us a great deal in reaching new people. Without further ado, on with the show.
So it's a seemingly simple question to start with, and that question is, do you think that Hideo Kojima deserves his reputation, for better or for worse, and for everything that you might take that as? Do you think that he deserves the reputation that he has?
For better or for worse, I think he deserves the for better bit of it. I mean, I would say that it's hard to argue seriously against the idea that he's had an enormous impact in how games are made, what people think a game can be, even specific design elements. I mean, like combat stealth elements in games are basically still copied from Metal Gear Solid. They're still basically the same thing. They have like a phase in which you're invisible, a phase in which you're caught, a phase in which you're trying to be invisible again, and like a cooldown on that. Like, it's basically the same thing still in basically every single stealth game. But I think the main thing that gives him, that means that his reputation is deserved on the positive sense, and we'll come to some of his reputation is what some people don't like him for in a bit, but it's kind of one and the same thing. And so there was this GDC talk in which he himself spoke about one of his sort of defining principles or goals in game design is to make the impossible possible. In the games that he gives people, you know, he wants them to feel like, oh wow, like I am seeing this thing that I thought was impossible, and me as a player am doing this thing that I thought was impossible, and that allows him to, you know, explore things that other people don't explore, give us experiences that we've not seen before, not felt before. And I think he largely has succeeded on that. Like, he does invent genres. Like, he basically invented a stealth action genre, Death Stranding, like whatever genre that is, he's invented that.
Much to the chagrin of marketing departments everywhere. Yeah, I think you're probably right. He does invent genres, which doesn't make it easy to sell these things up front, but, you know, who cares?
Yeah, but they still sell millions of copies. So I think, yeah, so he's a true visionary in that sense, I think. Like, he doesn't just take what is there and try to refine it or copy it. He will literally go sideways and do something else. And I think that does propel him forwards more than, I think, the absolute vast majority of people, of anyone who's ever tried to design a game before. Because it's not just that he's not just trying to do things that are just like obscure and weird for the sake of it. He's doing, and it's not just impossible things in terms of like the tech that he's using or this game design element. He's taking some quite serious emotions and feelings and, you know, pure kind of humane level things, and trying to develop a game that speaks to people back out. Like, you know, his games have a lot of combat in it, have a lot of death in it, have a lot of violence in it, but that's not really what they're about. Those things are just devices used to explore other elements of society or other elements of the human condition. And I think he's pretty, more than pretty, he's very, very successful in that. But then on the same token, people ridicule him for being overly weird and too difficult to sort of understand, and so that making the impossible possible remark is also just going to be more fuel to the fire for that crowd, which is where some of his kind of detractors will say that he's there's an interesting bit. I was he's overly serious. There's interest. I was replaying Death Stranding in anticipation of this podcast, and the first song credit that comes up is a song that's called "Don't Be So Serious," and surely that is just a nod to those people who are like, why are you so serious all the time, Hideo?
And you know what? I'm pretty sure that I remember that as you hear that refrain for the first time, I think within a second or two, the name that comes on screen is Hideo Kojima. I think it's one of his many credits, and it's like, I mean,
on the opposite side as well of the song title.
This is not coincidental. It's there's I think also the making the impossible possible thing, and the things he gets criticised for. I think you're right. There's an element of one and the same to an extent, and what I don't understand about that is what would be preferable to that. Like the notion that he has this idea of trying to achieve something that he himself may not reach and may know it isn't possible to enact the full extent of his vision, but he's going to try and he's going to get some way there. I prefer that idea. I prefer that idea of like, let's start with something that's really difficult, if not impossible to achieve, and at least we'll get some way there rather than not trying to do it at all and not getting any of the way there. Like I could just try and do something that I know I am well versed in, or I'm fully capable of, and I'll crank out this very nicely polished, incredible thing. Incredible in a different sense, but I won't have taken a step forward or as many steps forward as I want, and that's one of the big draws for me to Kojima. I might not always love his games. I mean, Death Stranding, for the record, Death Stranding is my favourite game of his. It's the one that talked to me the most. It's the one that had the biggest impact on me. And it's also one that several weeks ago now, if not several months ago, we talked about on the podcast as that was my pick for a game that I love but would never play again. I'm actually starting to rethink that. I've recently, in prep for this podcast, I've been going back and looking at videos, reading things, listening to the soundtrack of Death Stranding, and it's drawing me back in. It's certainly a game that I think about, not infrequently. It's a game that I'm always happy to talk about. It's a game that there is stuff to talk about. It's not just, isn't that a good game? So no, there's like a million things to talk about in that game. And some of which emanate from the player. And this is that thing that I think we talked about last week or the week before about you and I, me and anybody else, could play the same thing and take something different from it. And that's like, I just find that so much more interesting than, yes, we can all universally agree that this thing is amazing. Like that doesn't.
Yeah. Well, that's conceptual art, isn't it? So, which is, we take different concepts from the same piece of work. Although Kojima, interestingly, has said that games can never truly be art, but we don't necessarily need to concentrate on that argument all the time.
Open that can of worms.
Yeah, I think that's what makes him interesting. I mean, even if he doesn't get all the way there with what he's trying to do, you're right, and he opens the door. So he opens the door at least for himself later or someone else to then go through and continue. So he's opened up another, well, in this case, say game genre, if we want to classify it in that term. But I think it's themes in his games that are just so interesting. Like all of his games are just layered and layered and layered on themes in Metal Gear Solid, Death Stranding, and in everything. Like even in Snatcher, which I've not played, but I've been watching a bunch of on YouTube. Like it's very Blade Runner. It's a theme of what happens when humans become so mechanized and so cyborg that they're kind of indistinguishable from robots, and you can just replace humans with robots in the end. It's the same, you get the same result. But they're just so theme heavy, and I think with Death Stranding, the themes in there, or the themes that I pick up on there as being interesting, are so loneliness and building connections with people, which is what Kojima's spoken about as well in relation to that game. So I'm not like pretending that I've just sort of come up with this new reading of Death Stranding, but it's this idea that humanity is becoming less connected, it's becoming less interested in collective well-being, collective happiness, and collective progress. It's interesting timing with like Trump and Brexit and stuff like that. But when you play that game, like you're literally you're literally alone, and you're playing someone called Sam Porter Bridges, so you're literally carrying connections, I suppose. Porters.
Yep.
And you're in this barren environment. Your room, that sort of white room that you have, kind of lacks any kind of human element. One of the things that's really struck me about it was when I was replaying the opening few hours was that you interact through holograms and voice chats. Very rarely are you actually with another real person. And I wonder if that's designed to mimic the idea that the player playing the game is alone, and you're interacting with a machine. And Sam in the game is doing the same thing. So it's almost like mirroring back at you what you're doing. So in a way, it's kind of almost, you can read it as, say, critiquing the idea of humans interacting with machines, in this case, a video game system. And that's adding to the world being less connected. So he's almost holding the mirror up to video games themselves and saying, well, yeah, we're less connected, and maybe video games is something that plays into that. But I think that's sort of themes that I sort of pick up on a lot in Death Stranding is connection and loneliness, and the fact that the game kind of holds up a mirror to say, like, isn't this actually a bit lonely what you're doing here, just interacting with a machine all the time? And
because of that, sometimes it can be a game. I remember when I was deep into it, it would sometimes be, okay, I'm going to put a game on. What do I want to play? Well, right now I do want to play Death Stranding because I feel maybe I want that isolation. I want to put my headphones on. I want to turn the lights off, and I want that isolation. I want kind of that escape, I guess. And I want to go trekking across the US and making connections. Or maybe I don't want to see anybody. Maybe I just want to trek up into the mountains and do a couple of, pick up and drop off jobs. But by the same token, it would sometimes be the game that I didn't want to play because I didn't want the isolation. I wanted to forge connections. I wanted to, put some music on in the background and play a multiplayer game and be far more connected. And that is a game that not necessarily amplifies, but certainly facilitates or holds that mirror up. Yeah, sure. Like you can get what you need from it, but at the same time, it isn't what you need. It's it's not appealing to play it because it can make you feel more alone potentially. And like being alone is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. Of course, that's how it works. So yeah, I think the themes. Yeah, I mean, certainly the thing that I think I like about most of Kojima's games, Death Stranding in particular, but most of them, is that a lot of them are, it feels like designed from a kind of a feel first perspective. It's not wouldn't it be cool if, or this is going to be such an interesting gameplay loop to do it this way. I take from it like these are the things that I feel, and that I feel that Kojima's trying to convey, or at least trying to set up an environment to engage with these things if you want to. And Death Stranding definitely has that all over it. And I think and this thing about the conceptual notion of sometimes it will be something that I see and sometimes, somebody else won't see that same thing. I remember speaking to somebody, an industry person, let's say at least, raving about Death Stranding and saying, "Oh, it was amazing because of this."
Kojima that you were talking to?
It wasn't. No, I didn't get through to him on that particular day. But saying that it's amazing, there's this, and I raved about this one point where there's a pizza delivery, and I talked about this in the previous episode of the podcast, so I won't go into the details of it now, but there's a pizza delivery, and that whole thing is loaded with meaning. Whether you take the job in the first place, how you go about it, the work you could do in advance to make sure that you can get this particular thing to where it's going. There's a whole, it feels like a microcosm of the entire game in this one moment. And that applies to the whole game. Like Sam Porter Bridges, on his body, he's got handprints all over him, which is in reference to the BTs, but it's also quite literally like everybody wants a piece of him. They're putting their hands all over him. They all want a piece of what he can deliver. you also, throughout the game, largely travel from east to west, which is like from right to left, which in video games terms is backwards for us in the West. That's in most games, it's left to right. But for somewhere like Japan, from whence the game came, or in countries where you read a book from right to left, or the art is depicted in a different way, like the left-facing orientation means a different thing in art in Japan than it does to us. There's the whole notion of death in it, the fact that dead bodies corrode and eventually explode. That speaks to me of like the grieving process and the effect that death can have on those that are left behind. And there's all these things that even if none of this was intended, that to me doesn't matter, because like the fact that I've thought them and felt them makes them a truth.
It makes it real, like what you feel is important as what the creator intended,
and that's where the art comes in for me. It's like that's if the art and if art in general and stories and games and literature make me think and feel things, and they are effective in that way, then I'm not, that's the most important thing to me, basically, rather than is it objectively, if that even is such a thing, is it a great game? Is it I don't know if it's a great game, but it's an interesting one. Like we can talk about how interesting it is, and that's far more valuable to me than
I think one of the marks of a great game is if you're talking about it in a deep way as to how has it affected you, and how has it affected people differently, and what impact has it had, then it probably is a great game. Like, that doesn't mean everyone's going to love it or whatever, or even it's well, no, it probably will be remembered because people are still talking about it. But to go back to that pizza thing, it's interesting because one of the things that is, whilst Death Stranding is about loneliness and lack of connections and stuff, or building these connections, one of the things that you can do in the game is give likes and do stuff in the game that like leaves stuff around that you can get likes for. And I think that's an interesting element of it, in that it's a critique on the idea that like, social media and stuff like that, or that's how I see it, is social media and those sort of like-based interaction systems are supposedly making the world more connected and more engaged with each other and more about sharing things. But actually, is it really, or is it just a transactional relationship in I post this thing with the intention, with the goal, the end result is to get likes, get retweets, get shares, whatever. But actually, it's not about an emotional connection. It's not about a human connection. It's just purely transactional. And I wonder if the pizza thing, as almost the ultimate transactional process in terms of a direct interaction that you can have with a human. Here's your pizza, here's your money, see you later, bye, I'm gone. That you don't even have to leave your house for, so you don't even have to make that leap of connection. I wonder if the pizza thing is kind of another instance of showing that the transactional nature of interactions that we that are becoming more common as things like distance communication, through the internet and stuff, becomes the norm rather than the secondary way of communicating. And obviously with the pandemic and lockdown and stuff, that's even more relevant now, as people are forced into that world rather than choosing it. Yeah.
Well, yes. Yeah, very possibly. I think there's a lot of where it comes in the game is particularly pertinent as well. I think I talked before about like this convenience thing. You go from being this person that can deliver these vital services to being something of a convenience for certain people. The fact that the pizza is ordered by the game's antagonist for you to go and find his hideout is a whole sub kind of theme of secrets and identity. But yeah, there's this whole thing going on in this single moment that could, by the same token, be looked at as dumb. Like somebody could look at that and go, oh, that's dumb because I'm ordering a pizza. Why am I going to do that? And that's not invalid. That is not I certainly don't agree with it. I think there's a whole lot more to see. But then somebody else might look at that and say, you are reading far too much into that. It's just somebody making you do something in a game that they know you're probably going to do, and it's busy work. Like we criticise other games for being filled with just lists of things to do and icons all over the map, which interestingly Death Stranding doesn't really have. There's certainly a map, there's certainly some icons on it, but you don't have that. It's an open world in a way that we're not really used to, because you don't have that idea of let's go and unlock a tower and find all of the icons that pop up and give me stuff to do. It's an open world that has more emergent qualities than I think we're used to in modern video games, and that's, it's not an open world that exists. It's not a player orientated open world. It's just an open world in that it's a space that you can explore, and to an extent you derive your own enjoyment from that, and that's not, some people are going to look at that and say that's just not enjoyable. I don't.
The idea that like his games are dumb, or like they do dumb things, like that's quite a common thing that people will say as well, like even with like Metal Gear Solid. So, oh my god, it's so dumb, look at that like boss that's like this weird flying guy who can like tap into your mind and understand everything you're doing. But he uses these really exaggerated devices like that, and these exaggerated scenes, these exaggerated characters to make very, very sort of poignant points. So, I mean, in Metal Gear Solid, even though it's got a lot of shooting and people with guns in it and stuff, nuclear warheads, it's an anti-war game through not only its themes and its writing, but also in its action, in that you're supposed to play stealth and you're rewarded for not killing people. You're rewarded for being non-violent. You get better rewards and you get better scoring stuff at the end if you don't kill people. But again, like Death Stranding, people say it's silly, but what's Metal Gear Solid really about? It's about, it's anti-war. Yes, that's one of its obviously big messages, and it ties into a lot of post-World War II feeling that Japanese people have, and the negativity against war, and the I can't remember exactly what the Japanese call it. It's not, they don't call it the passive approach, but their government, they've adopted this non-violent doctrine anyway, that they will never invade people ever again. They will defend themselves, but they won't invade. But really, Metal Gear Solid is also about how individuals are capable of breaking out of the structure and limitations from which they're born, I guess. So Liquid Snake is fueled and angry at this belief, and it's right, it's an incorrect belief, but he believes it to be true, that he's gotten the bad genes, and him and Solid are clones of Big Boss, and Liquid thinks he's got the bad genes, and Solid's got the good ones. And
you believe that as the player as well, right? Because until you find out later otherwise, you're being told that that's the first you hear of it, and the first you hear of it is his interpretation of it, and so in that way it becomes true for a time.
It becomes true within the fiction of the world and the game and everything, and everything you understand of it. From Solid's perspective. So he's beating himself up over this idea that he's inferior and he's born into this inferiority. And then by having you as Solid Snake literally fight someone who is wrapped up in this concept that he's born to be inferior, he's commenting the idea that, you should be fighting against the idea that you are just what you were born into, that you are beholden to your ancestry, that you are beholden to this and this and this restriction or limitation that you were born into. That's literally what the final boss fight in that game is. It's you as Solid beating that concept down, the concept embodied by Liquid Snake. And it's interesting because he was talking about how his parents grew up in World War II. They experienced some of World War II, and then the Japanese inferiority that came out of World War II, that they'd just beaten in a war. American occupied troops are much taller than them and much more muscly than them, so they're just walking around with this, not only have they lost a war, but this constant reminder that they're inferior physically. So it would make perfect sense that he would then make a game about like, no, you don't have to be bound by that sense of inferiority. Like, you're not inferior, you're only inferior if you believe yourself to be, and then allow yourself to get caught up in that, and then you become this tormented, horrible person like Liquid Snake is.
Yeah. Well, so then by the same token, because I think it's necessary to introduce an element of balance to it, that this doesn't mean, certainly not for me, it doesn't mean that means everything that Kojima does I think is amazing, or everything that he does is just misunderstood, and if you only got it, there's some parts of it that I understand perfectly well and just don't get on with, and it doesn't do anything for me, and I don't agree with. And I also, on a pretty basic level, I don't think there's any game that I want to sit through 70 odd minutes of cutscenes for in one. It's got a world record. Metal Gear 4 has got a world record for like longest cutscene at something like 27 minutes. And then longest sequence of cutscenes at 71 minutes. I don't get on with that. I don't want to sit through that necessarily. I want to experience things through play and enjoy those feelings that I am deriving from it through playing it. But I don't want to just sit and put the controller down and watch it because I could, do other stuff in that same time to achieve or to hear those same messages. So it's not, I don't think it's certainly not a question for me that, is it just that everything that Kojima does is amazing, and if you just look at it in the right way, because it isn't that, I think. And certainly, everything he produces has flaws, but the very fact that he's attempting to produce these things, I think, makes for a far more interesting video game landscape than not. And he's somebody that I'm always interested in what he is going to do next. That's, on a very personal level of designers and, video game studios. This is something we've talked about before, about this notion of maybe having a series where we look at these kinds of things. And Kojima is one of those that it doesn't matter what type of game he's making, I'm interested in what it is. Even if I'm not particularly interested in that genre normally, or, that's like horror, for example. PT, still haven't finished that. The idea that he might be making another longer, fully fledged actual horror game rather than a short kind of experience or demo, both intrigues me and scares the crap out of me, because if he can make me feel the things, or if I do feel the things from playing his games, they make me think about things, they stick with me. The notion of being exposed to a horror game that does the same thing, I mean, I'm interested in it, but I'm also scared by it.
Yeah, well, I think that's because the best horror film, best horror things, or I would say, like, it's interesting for me, him doing a horror game, is because the best horror books, games, movies, are about emotion and feeling. They're not about like gore and slashing blood around the screen. It's about questioning some of the corest, deepest things that you believe about yourself, or the society that you live in believes about itself, or wants to believe about itself. On the cutscene thing, like I do agree that he can be a bit self-indulgent, and that he does take his desires to and he fulfills on his desires in a way that isn't necessarily always to the game's best result. But I would also say that whilst, yes, I probably don't want to sit through 70 minutes cutscenes in a continuous thing with only pressing X now and again in between it, I think the exception is Kojima games, in that I don't mind them in his games because they are interesting and the characters are just so crazy. And they often do a lot of interesting things, like in the really long cutscenes that I presume you're referring to Metal Gear Solid. There was some Metal Gear Solid 4 ones that just like went round and around and around. Yeah. But they do interesting things. They focus on little things. I remember a scene where someone's cooking an egg in that cutscene, and it lasts for like a few minutes, and it's just this like, just amongst all this wild craziness and fighting and stuff, like here's this like very human moment with this person cooking an egg. And I think it's also, we have to also just kind of catch ourselves a little bit as well. Like when I was talking about Liquid Snake and the whole being caught up in feeling like you're limited to your ancestry and the position in the world you're born into, and fighting against that or not fighting against it and allowing it to consume you. That's very similar to Akira as well, in which Tetsuo in that film gets consumed by Akira, like this sort of force, and he allows that to consume him because he was like the runt of the gang. He was the one that's like, oh, I'm never going to be above this. I'm never going to be as cool as Kaneda and like the other people in the gang. And this new thing that he's got, it's like, wow, like, okay, I'm just going to let this just take over my entire existence now, because if I was just left to my own devices and I was left to my own limitations, I could never be anything better. So like, it's not like his stuff is necessarily wholly original either, but then I wonder if that doesn't matter, and in the medium that he's working in, it is original, like it is, and because he's communicating it to you through play, it is original because of the form and of its delivery.
Yeah, and that there's a lot to be said for that. I think watching it is a different art form, obviously, but it's a different sculpting that and crafting that experience is entirely different when you are not in control of, for example, the camera all the time, unless you
take it away and you have a 70-minute cut.
Yeah, so that's how you get around that problem. But yeah, if you're not engaging with something or experiencing it in a linear fashion, you're not reading a book from back to front, or you're not watching a film from back to front, or even, music is perhaps one of the most, for me, one of the most common parallels, because the way that an album is put together is telling a story. If you decide to listen to that on shuffle, then that's doing a different thing. That's experiencing that piece of art in a different way to potentially the way that it was intended, the way that it was authored, at least.
Yeah.
And so Kojima games are similar, Death Stranding in particular for me, because you can do whatever you want. You can play for 8 hours and never touch the main quest line or, whatever. And that, to be able to still convey those themes that you're intending to convey, or set up a situation where they can be experienced, is very different, and I think is going to probably have more hit and miss because you're less in control as the creator. And so I guess perhaps a bit more leeway should be given in terms of, did you feel this particular theme at every minute of this game? Well, of course not. Like, or in hour 5, did you feel like this? Well, I was doing something different to what you were doing in hour 5. So it is a different thing.
Yeah, and I think tied into that as well, like the hit and miss thing, like even though you spent a huge percentage of his career on Metal Gear Solid, he doesn't stay still, because like even within Metal Gear Solid, like he pushes it a lot. Like the first couple of games were in man-made sort of closed-off environments in Shadow Moses and the Tanker, but then Metal Gear Solid 3 went into the jungle. Metal Gear Solid 4 was in the more open world sort of environment in the desert-y landscape, in which there were 2 sets of enemies who were fighting each other. So then you're positioned sort of as a wedge between them, and it's up to you how you use that against them. Metal Gear Solid 5 was obviously huge, large, massive open world with loads of different environments. And then Death Stranding is a massive open world in which you're making things on the world, and you're seeing the evidence of other people making things onto the world as well. So I think he does maybe have a reputation in some circles of just kind of sticking to the same old things, and it's the same old stuff that he's giving you again and again. But I think that's a bit unfair. I think that's just taking the titles of the game and saying, oh, that's another Metal Gear Solid. And well, yeah, but it's not like the game. Each Metal Gear Solid is different to the next in a way that few franchises are. Like they're much more different than like the Uncharted games are from each other. For example, like much more.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. That idea that, because there is a refrain which is like, oh, it's typical Kojima or something like that. But then it's like, well, what is it about it that's typical? Oh, well, it's kind of out there. It's odd. It's doing these strange things. It's like, if you have to be known, if somehow being different and exploring different themes and presenting things in different ways somehow typifies your behavior, then that sounds like that's a very interesting typical to be. Like, it's typical in that what you can rely on him to do something that is against the norm. That's a good thing. Surely, like,
that makes everything he does worth looking at least.
Yeah,
everything. And I think that's probably a good comment to just end the podcast on. But if you've got a game designer, if you've got a creator, if you've got an artist, if you've got anyone providing you with anything, and everything is worth looking at because you expect it to be atypical, you expect it to be challenging, you expect it to be not just derivative. Then that's iconic, isn't it? Surely, like that. Like if you're in a position when everything you did, like people are like, okay, we're going to look at it no matter what, and we're going to pay real attention to try to understand this. Like, that's pretty successful in my eyes. Like, I don't know what more someone could do, really. Like, you don't have to, like you say, you don't have to love all of his stuff, but well, maybe that's the point. Like, even if you don't love all of his stuff, I think that there's, and even if you don't like it on a personal level, if you don't find it entertaining and you don't care about the messages in it, like, I think there's still has to be like a level of respect leveled at him. Like, I think it's disrespectful to give someone of that's created the stuff that he's created and moved the whole medium forward in a way, and just sort of write him off as this like self-indulgent sort of dreamer. Like, that's a bit ridiculous.
The final thing I think I will say, we do need to wrap up, but I think the final thing I want to add to that, I think, along that lines of giving him that time, giving him the things that he creates, the respect of looking at them, that doesn't necessarily mean to me that you need to go out and buy every one of his games and play them. But I would say if you haven't played Death Stranding in particular, as his most recent example, if you haven't played Death Stranding, you were turned off it at launch, I would say go and look at a lot of the media that's been produced since, or a lot of the content in various forms of media that's been produced since Death Stranding came out. There are a lot more videos now about what Death Stranding is that are not based on a knee-jerk reaction, or that are not based on a need to get content out the door within X period of the game coming out, because that's when it's going to be most popular. And those things are far more interesting. I think those things will help anybody that hasn't played Death Stranding examine and assess whether it is for them or not, far more really than a conventional review would. And then you can make up your mind. And also, as an added bonus, you'll probably get Death Stranding for an awful lot cheaper than you would have. And in fact, I think is that one of the PS Plus collection games on PS5? Might be. I'm really just like that idea of staying curious. Like, just be curious about it and look into it without the need to understand it fully. Just go into it knowing that there is stuff to be understood and open yourself up to that, rather than worrying about whether you're going to get everything and it's all going to make sense. Like, just go into it, be curious, and see what you take from it.
So, it sounds as though your job is now to go away and play Death Stranding, either again or for the first time. And once you've done your homework, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Hideo Kojima and his games. You can get in touch with us on social media. We are at Indie by Design on all platforms. That's at Indie by Design on all platforms. Additionally, I'd just like to point out that we release Gaming the Podcast in both traditional podcast form on podcasting platforms and also via YouTube. So make of that what you will, as I know that some people prefer to use YouTube. I know that some people prefer podcasting apps, so the choice is there. Finally, as ever, don't forget to check out indiebydesign.net, where you can pick up our video game books. That's indiebydesign.net. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.